Review of what the lesson that we was going over on Sunday. And if you remember, we're in looking at the prophecy of the nations being blessed through Abraham in Genesis 12. And so far, last week we looked at just how hard it is for someone to predict future events, that basically it's impossible to look out a few years or 1,000 years from now and for any normal person to be able to tell what the future holds. So without God in the process, we know this really can't happen. And because we know that all prophecy is from God. So we started with the promise that was given to Abraham by God in Genesis 12:3. And it said, "And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So then we continued through the promise of Abraham and Sarah having a son in their old age, and then the birth of Isaac to them. We saw in Genesis chapter 22 where God tested Abraham and told him to offer his son Isaac as a burnt offering. And because Abraham was willing to follow through and show just how much faith he had in God, an angel of the Lord called to him and stopped him. This was in Genesis 22:11. So now to start out tonight, I want to read few verses starting in Genesis chapter 22. We'll be reading from verses 15 to 18. Genesis 22, 15 to 18. It says, "Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, 'By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Indeed, I will greatly bless you, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens, and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your seed shall possess the gate of their enemies, and in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice.'" So does anybody remember what the theme of the Bible is? Correct, the redemption of man. So we continue to see that God's promises is being restated over and over again to Abraham. And so tonight we're going to pick up and start following the seed line being passed down from Abraham to his descendants. And remember that God told Abraham, "I will multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens and as the sand which is on the seashore." So that was kind of just a short recap of what we had looked at on Sunday, and now we're going to get into our lesson for tonight. So as we move forward in this story, at this time now, Sarah has died at the age of 127. So now I want to go over to Genesis 24, and we'll start reading there in verses 1 to 4. It says, "Now Abraham was old, advanced in age, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in every way. And Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his household, who had charge of all that he owned, 'Please place your hand under my thigh, and I will make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you shall not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I live, but you shall go to my country and to my relatives and take a wife for my son Isaac.' So we know in this story that an angel of the Lord led the servant to Mesopotamia, to the city of Nahor, to look for a wife for Isaac. And if you remember during this process, after he got there, he was looking for the girl or the daughter of the men. He was looking for one that would come out whenever he asked her to give him a drink of water. He was looking for one that would tell him that she would also water his camels. And this was supposed to be the sign to him. So we know that actually it was Rebekah, when she came out, that he asked for a drink from her, and then she did say, "Let me water your camels also." So this was a sign. And Rebekah was a daughter of Bethuel, and so he brought her back to Isaac. So now I want to go over to Genesis chapter 25. And we will be reading verses 19 through 21. Now these are the records of the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham became the father of Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Paddan Aram, the sister of Laban, the Aramean, to be his wife. And Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren. And the Lord answered him, and Rebekah his wife conceived. So now Isaac, we know, is 40 years old. He's married Rebekah. And starting in this part of the chapter, we now know that they were going to have two sons. Esau will be the oldest, and Jacob. So in chapter 25, I want to read verses 29 to 33. This will just kind of give us a little bit of idea of what was going on with Jacob and Esau at the time. So when Jacob had cooked stew, Esau came in from the field, and he was famished. And Esau said to Jacob, "Please let me have a swallow of that red stuff, for I am famished." Therefore his name was called Edom. But Jacob said, "First sell me your birthright." And Esau said, "Behold, I am about to die, so what use then is the birthright to me?" And Jacob said, "First swear to me." So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went on his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. So it seemed like it was kind of strange that just because he didn't eat at this time, he thought he was going to die. But just because of this, he ended up selling his birthright to Jacob just for some bread and for some stew. So now we're going to see the seed line being passed down from Abraham to Isaac. So we're going to go to Genesis chapter 26 in verses 1 to 4. Now there was a famine in the land besides the previous famine that had occurred in the days of Abraham. So Isaac went to Gerar to Abimelech, king of the Philistines, and the Lord appeared to him and said, "Do not go down to Egypt. Stay in the land of which I shall tell you. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. For to you and to your descendants I will give all these lands, and I will establish the oath which I swore to your father Abraham. And I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven, and will give your descendants all these lands. And by your descendants all the nations of the earth shall be blessed." And then in verse 5 it says, "Because Abraham obeyed me and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws." So we know that because Abraham was faithful to God, that the blessing continues through him at this time. So a question I'd like to ask, was Abraham, was he a perfect in everything he did? Did he have any problems?
Yes, problems, though not perfect.
Exactly. But he was faithful, right? And we know that God can use everyone, whomever he wants and chooses, and he can use every situation to fulfill his plan and his promise. So even though Abraham, we know he had a lot of problems, but still, everything he did, he would still continue to be faithful to God. Any comments up to this? Anything?
One of the interesting things is that there are men in the Scriptures that because of their life, God favored other people. And it just said here, because Abraham obeyed my voice. And this is some of the things that happened as a result of Abraham's obedience to his faith. When we get down to the kings and the prophets, a lot of times kings, even though they were evil, but because of David, the scripture would just say the similar thing. Because of David, you will have this happen to you, which is good or favorable. So we don't understand, or we don't think sometimes how much can be accomplished by people when they are faithful to God. I mean, they may be dead, but because of their faithfulness, it trickles on down to some other generations of people. And we see that even today. The great men of faith today, they not be great as far as having to be written about, but you see their descendants, how they fare in the service of the king.
And that's what we see through Abraham, because we know, because he was willing to give his son, that God used him, and God continued to pass the seed line down and to bless Abraham and his descendants throughout history. And if anybody has any comments, just you raise your hand. If I don't see you, say something, because sometimes I tend to not see everybody in the room whenever I'm up here. So now in Genesis chapter 28, verse 1, it says, "So Isaac called Jacob and blessed him and charged him and said to him, 'You shall not take a wife from the daughters of Canaan.'" Why do you suppose that Isaac didn't want Jacob to marry a Canaanite? Wasn't this the same problem that we had with Abraham and Isaac? That Abraham didn't want him to marry a Canaanite, but he wanted him to go back to their family. So does anybody have any thoughts on that as to why it would be this way? Excuse- Okay, good. She said they need to keep a pure bloodline to trace the lineage. Anybody? We'll take it.
The descendants of Abraham were still in Mesopotamia, and so and the people they went back and married are of the bloodline of Abraham's family. So as I studied, I come to the conclusion, this is Jim Ward, I come to the conclusion that the family was a faithful family to God, even though they did not go with Abraham when he left, but still yet they were a people that God favored because of their religion, their faith in Him. At least that's my understanding, my opinion.
Well, and I believe that's right, because if we know about the Canaanites, they worship false gods. And like you said, and I believe that Abraham and Isaac both wanted their son to marry a woman that was faithful to God and that was in their bloodline, and that wouldn't draw them away to start worshiping false gods and get away from God. So Isaac tells Jacob to go to Paddan Aram to find a wife. In chapter 28, verse 3, it says, "And may God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and multiply you, that you may become a company of peoples. May He also give you the blessing of Abraham to you, to your descendants with you, that you may possess the land of your sojournings, which God gave to Abraham." So now we'll see the seed line continue on and move into Jacob. So we're still in chapter 28. I want to read verses 10 through 15. It says, "Then Jacob departed from Beersheba and went toward Haran. And he came to a certain place and spent the night there, because the sun had set. And he took one of the stones of the place and put it under his head, and lay down in that place. And he had a dream, and behold, a ladder was set on the earth, with its top reaching to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, 'I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give it to you and to your descendants. Your descendants shall also be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread out to the west, to the east, and to the north, to the south. And in you and in your descendants shall all the families of the earth be blessed. And behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you.'" So if we look at this story, starting with Abraham and going through Jacob, I think we can see how God continues to tell each one, as it's passed down, that all the nations will be blessed through Abraham. And we can see how the seed line continues through each son or each heir to the next generation. God revealed to each man that all the nations of the earth would be blessed through him. He told this to Abraham in Genesis 18:18, Isaac in Genesis 26:4, and Jacob in Genesis 28:13 and 14. So God revealed these prophecies to them over a period of about 137 years. Now that's a pretty short time span to God, but to us, that would be a lot of years. We would never see it. And of course, we know that none of them ever saw the prophecies fulfilled totally, but they had faith that it would happen because God had promised this to them. So often, for me, when I think of time, I think of maybe like a day, could be a week, month, or even a couple of years. But like I said, God's concept of time is a lot different from us. It was over 1,800 years from the time that he told Abraham that he was going to bless all of his posterity until the time it was actually fulfilled when Jesus came. But to God, for us, it's a long period of time. If we think about 1,800 years, but to God, it's just a blink of an eye. Time is nothing to him. So this will finish up looking at the prophecy. Yes, Kathy?
Is that what he means when he says, I will not leave you until I have done what I've promised you? Is that the coming of Jesus? Is that what the second coming?
Does anybody have any thoughts on that? The way I looked at it, it said I will not leave you until I have done what I've promised to you. I think to me, the way, now I may not be wrong, this is just the way I look at it, but to me it looks like he's saying that he will always be there, even though they may not see it happen, but I think he's telling them that he's going to always be there all the way through. I think talking about descendants, because even like if you look at us, we're not actually in the bloodline, but we'll get to this in a little bit too, that I think he is talking more about the descendants, in the future. Anybody else?
I would say it's a double promise. There's
Okay.
immediacy to, he just finished saying, yeah, I'm sending you away, but I'm going to bring you back.
Mhm.
And I'll be with you, the whole way. So,
Okay.
God knows, even though Jacob doesn't have a clue, that Jacob's about to be gone for a pretty long time. But in that process, he's making it abundantly clear to Jacob, don't get discouraged, don't fret. I'm with you, and I'm going to bring you back.
Okay. Jim?
God told Abraham that he was going to make him a mighty nation of many, as the descendants of the stars of heaven or the sand of the sea. And in the next verse, it says that you would be in bondage for 400 years.
Right.
So they did become a mighty nation, but they did not become a nation until after they came out of Egypt.
Right.
So they were probably, with most calculations, anywhere from 2 to 3 million people that came out of Egypt to go to the promised land. They didn't all go there, but that's when they became a nation. That's when they were called a nation of people. They were not a nation of people until after they came out of Egyptian bondage. They were there for 400 years, and that's what God had told Abraham, that they would be a servant to another people
Mhm.
for 400 years.
Right. Okay. Kenneth?
I'm counting two blessings out of this. One is the seed of Abraham as far as physical, the nation of Israel,
Mm-hmm.
but the blessing to all nations, which would be to Christ. So that there's a weave of two blessings in that one.
Right, and we'll see how this all ties into the New Testament. Because like you say, it's just a thread, as Jamie pointed out, it's just a thread going through the Old Testament that continues on, that we will see as we study several of these different prophecies, that I think we'll see this as it goes through, that we'll be able to see what's going on. So now I want us to turn to the New Testament, to the book of Acts. In this, in chapter 3, Acts chapter 3, I'm going to read from verse 11 to 13. But if you remember, in this part of the story, Peter has just healed the lame beggar, and he's telling them that Jesus is the prophet that God told Abraham about. So in chapter 3, verse 11, and while he was still clinging to Peter and John, all the people ran together to them at the so-called portico of Solomon, full of amazement. But when Peter saw this, he replied to the people, Men of Israel, why do you marvel at this, or why do you gaze at us, as if by our own power or piety we had made him walk? The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the the God of our fathers has glorified his servant Jesus, the one whom you delivered up and disowned in the presence of Pilate when he had decided to release him. So he's telling them that Jesus is the one that's spoken of by the prophets of old. And so if we go to Acts in the same chapter 3, I want to read in verses 25 and 26. It is you who are the sons of the prophets and of the covenant which God made with your fathers, saying to Abraham, and in your seed all the families of the earth shall be blessed. For you first God raised up his servant and sent him to bless you by turning every one of you from your wicked ways. So now we see we're starting in the New Testament where it's talking about where the prophecy is being fulfilled. Because this refers all the way back to Genesis to chapter 12 where it started. So now, something I'd like to ask you, how many of you really get excited about tracing your genealogy, your ancestors, want to find out about your family history? Does that excite anybody? Okay, there's a few. Well, I have a cousin. She lives down in Houston. And she's the type, she's really very excited about genealogy, about finding out about her family. So she's the one that when she travels across country, she stops at all the hot spots in town. She stops at the cemeteries because she wants to see if there's anybody there in her family history. And she'll go to the courthouses and she'll read for hours and hours, go through documents. And then if she finds anything, she'll go out to the cemeteries and she'll walk for hours just looking at headstones, trying to find if part of her heritage is in this town or if it's in another town. And that's what she loves to do. So we know that nowadays there's a lot of people that really get excited about genealogy and tracing their ancestors to see where they came from or who they really are. So for you, would you get excited if you found out that somebody very famous was in your heritage? Maybe like George Washington, or an astronaut like Alan Shepard, or maybe somebody in the baseball like Babe Ruth. Would it excite you if you found out somebody really famous or interesting was in your family heritage? I think probably a lot of us could agree to that. But then, on the other hand, what if you found somebody in your heritage that was really a really bad person? And I'm not going to call any names, but there's plenty of history that you can look at that people were bad. And if you saw somebody like that, like the Boston Strangler, if that was in your history, would you want to tell people that you were kin to them? I mean, really, would you want to tell people, say, yeah, it was way back my uncle? You know, I don't think most of us really want to tell people that when we have something bad. So if we look at it, we know that there's a lot of good in history and there's a lot of bad as far as in your heritage. And just like with this country, there's a lot of bad things that happen and a lot of good, but still, we need to look back at it and really see where we came from. And that's what I want us to see as we look at parts of this in the New Testament. So have you ever started reading in the Bible, and when it gets to where it starts naming names, it just keeps going on and on and on, and then you just kind of, after the first verse, maybe you say, I'm going to skip to the last, and you read the last name, then you keep going. Well, I've done this in the past because you just think, when you're looking at all these names, sometimes you think, I don't need to know all this. But I believe if we look at the genealogy of Jesus, that it can help us see exactly where he came from and the prophecy that was fulfilled through the seed line if we look at this. So now, we want to turn to Matthew chapter 1. I think I got one behind. So we'll be in Matthew chapter 1, verse 1. And we're going to read through about verse 17, and this is going to be talking about the genealogy of Jesus. So the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. To Abraham was born Isaac, and to Isaac Jacob, and to Jacob Judah and his brothers. And to Judah were born Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and to Perez was born Hezron, and to Hezron Ram. And to Ram was born Amminadab, and to Amminadab Nahshon, and to Nahshon Salmon, and to Salmon was born Boaz by Rahab. And to Boaz was born Obed by Ruth, and to Obed Jesse. To Jesse was born David the king. And to David was born Solomon by her who had been the wife of Uriah. And to Solomon was born Rehoboam, and to Rehoboam Abijah, and Abijah Asa, and to Asa was born Jehoshaphat. To Jehoshaphat Joram, and to Joram Uzziah. To Uzziah was born Jotham, and to Jotham Ahaz, and to Ahaz Hezekiah. To Hezekiah was born Manasseh, and to Manasseh Amon, and to Amon Josiah, and to Josiah were born Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the deportation to Babylon. And after the deportation to Babylon, to Jeconiah was born Shealtiel, and to Shealtiel Zerubbabel. To Zerubbabel was born Abihud, and to Abihud Eliakim. And to Eliakim Azor, and to Azor was born Zadok, and to Zadok Achim, and to Achim Eliud. And to Eliud was born Eleazar, and to Eleazar Mathan. To Mathan Jacob, and to Jacob was born Joseph, the husband of Mary, by whom was born Jesus, who is called Christ. Therefore all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations, and from David to the deportation of Babylon, 14 generations, and from the deportation to Babylon to the time of Christ, 14 generations. So it may be a little hard to see that up there, I don't know, but if we look at that, we can see that it traces back the lineage of Jesus all the way back to Abraham. And in Matthew 1 verse 6, it says Jesse was the father of David the king. So does anybody recall anything that we looked at earlier in the first lesson about a king? Okay, if we look back to Genesis 17:6, this is talking about Abraham, and it says, I will make nations of you, and kings shall come forth from you. And in verse 16 to Sarah, it says, she shall be a mother of nations, kings of people shall come from her. So if we look at this, we can see that God had already told them what was going to be in the lineage, that there would be kings that would come from them. So before we get started too much more, I want to look at in the introduction to the Gospel of Matthew in my NASB study Bible. I want to read just a little portion of what it says. It says, Matthew's main purpose is to prove to his Jewish readers that Jesus is their Messiah. He does this primarily by showing how Jesus, in his life and ministry, fulfilled the Old Testament scriptures. Matthew even finds the history of God's people in the Old Testament recapitulated or restated in some aspects of Jesus' life. So to accomplish his purpose, Matthew also emphasizes Jesus' Davidic lineage. So it is important to see the lineage from Abraham to Jesus. So now we know that where we're going, but were all the people in the lineage from Abraham to Jesus were, which we've already said that, were all of them really good people and didn't have anything, problems or anything bad in their background? Well, I think we've already figured that out, that everybody has problems. So maybe it's just to show us that Jesus came from real people. This is just what I'm looking at. But I think it can show us that Jesus came from real people just like you and I, and that they made mistakes, they had sin in their life, and they were good and they were bad. So I think it's trying to show us the human side where Jesus came from. So can anybody tell me any examples of someone back in the history of the lineage of Jesus that was maybe not a really, some parts of it was not really a good person? Or anything you can remember bad? Hagar? Okay. Who? Okay.
Manasseh spent most of his life evil.
Right.
He repented by the end.
There was a lot of them that were evil, and there was some that we consider that were good, but they still had some bad things. One of them that I want us to look at, what about Rahab? Okay. Well, we know who Rahab, we know what her profession was, and we know who she was. And we know that she lied about some things, but she was a Canaanite, and she was enemies of Israel. But okay. Oh, okay. Who? Mm-hmm. Right. You could name just practically everybody. And that's the point I'm making, that there's really nobody that had everything good in their life. But we can read about Rahab in Joshua chapter 2, in chapter 6, verses 17, and then 22 through 25, and in Hebrews 11:31, which we won't get into right now. But there was another one that I was considering. What about King David? Now, wasn't he called the man after God's own heart? But still, we know that he had some problems. So, okay. But it does name her in the, in one of the charts that I looked at for the actual seed line. When it comes to that point, it does show that it says Bathsheba, and it says the wife of Uriah. But it does say Bathsheba. No, not in Matthew 1. Right. No, it doesn't say that in Matthew, but like in one of the charts I was looking at, it does show where she was, there in the lineage.
But when he read it, it said her, who had been the wife of Uriah.
Right. So we know the story of his sin with Bathsheba and how he made a plan to cover up what he had done, and eventually it led to what we would call the murder of Bathsheba's husband Uriah. So what I'm trying to show is that nobody has a perfect history in their ancestry. Even though there were some good people, everybody has problems. We have problems, and everybody from the start has had problems in their life. So I want to go to Galatians chapter 3. So it'll be Galatians chapter 3. And I'm just going to read verse 16. It says, "Now the promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed. He does not say, and to seeds, as referring to many, but rather to one, and to your seed, that is Christ." So now the promise was spoken to Abraham and to his seed. So we see that as it continues, that the seed line is being passed down. And this goes back from the New Testament showing us this. So this will go all the way back to Genesis chapter 3. It says, "I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." So in verse 29 of this same chapter, it says, "And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's descendants, heirs according to the promise." So this shows that the promise is extended. I believe it's showing us that it's extended to everybody today. That even though we got past the seed line, but from Christ, it shows us that we are all in it today. So now I want to look at Hebrews 2 and verse 16. So Hebrews 2 and 16. It says, "For assuredly he does not give us help to his angels, for assuredly he does not give help to angels, but he gives help to the descendant of Abraham. Therefore he had to be made like his brethren in all things, that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people." So does this show us that the human side of Jesus that he was actually, it showed that he actually had to be human and that he had to represent mankind in order to become one of them. So I want to finish reading in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 17, 18, and 19 one more time. So it says, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was offering up his only begotten son. It was he to whom it was said, in Isaac your descendants shall be called. He considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, from which he also received him back as a type. So if we look back at the story in Genesis, where it all started with Abraham, I think we can follow the promise and the lineage all the way to Jesus and continuing today. Because of Abraham's great faith, even though he couldn't see into the future, he trusted that God would keep his promise and that all nations through him would be blessed. So that's all I have on this lesson that will wrap us up from the seed of Abraham and through the nations. But there was a verse, we got just a couple of minutes. If we don't get through, then we'll quit. But there was a verse, Galatians 3 and 8, and I'll read it again. It says, in the scripture foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, all the nations shall be blessed in you, referring back to Genesis 12 and 3. So what do you think Paul was saying here? Because if you remember, Paul wrote this 1,800 years or so after the promise was given to Abraham. He was inspired by the same God to write this letter to Galatians as Moses was to write the first 5 books of the Bible. So what does it mean that the gospel had been preached to Abraham? Does anybody have any thoughts on that? I'd never really looked at this before, but it just kind of caught my eye, and I had to look at it for a little bit. But does anybody have anything that? It's the good news. Right. Right. Right.
But when it became real is when the church became into existence in Acts 2, when people were baptized into Christ, and they were in the kingdom, which is in Christ, which is Christ is the Savior of all the body, which is the kingdom. And it was a fulfillment that he made to Abraham. So if you looked at the whole thing, it's a pretty big picture.
Right.
Beautiful picture when you look at it.
And that's what kind of the line I was going down, because I just put down potentially God was revealing or preaching the gospel, the good news of Jesus to him through the promise that he told him. So even though Abraham couldn't see this, but that's what he was bringing Jesus back to that time. And that's where we can see Jesus in the Old Testament from the New Testament, going back and all the promises that's being fulfilled and all the prophecy being fulfilled in the New Testament. So does anybody have anything else to? Right. And that's who they was talking to in the Galatians. He was actually talking to the Gentiles and telling them that this is going to be fulfilled, that you are now part of the seed line. Okay, that's the class for this evening. Thank you for all your comments. Appreciate it.